It's Walkout Wednesday, and it feels like the entire workforce has downed tools. I'm counting my blessings that cameraman Steve turned up for tonight's show. Britain isn't working, quite literally. And right now, not working is being leveraged as a political tool with the teaching unions, the nursing unions, the ambulance workers, lecturers, posties, firefighters, civil servants, bus drivers, you name it, all holding the government and the country to ransom for inflation-busting pay rises that the country simply cannot afford. Now, I completely understand that nurses, teachers and the rest are struggling, and they do an incredible job for the country. They deserve a pay rise. And the unions, of course, are simply doing their job, trying to get their people the best possible deal. Who could blame them? But anything above the 5% that's been offered to most unions, money the private sector would bite your hand off for, is economically illiterate, immoral and deeply irresponsible. The main reason why millions of Brits are struggling is because of inflation, which raises the cost of basic goods like energy and food, and which reduces the value of the pound in your pockets and the size of your wage packets. It's a perfect storm. But to subsidise the public sector against rising prices is effectively to conduct an arms race with inflation, which doesn't end well. Wages go up, prices go up with them, and you bake inflation into the system for years to come. And be clear, a high inflation economy is a dying economy. Inflation is a tax on everyone. Sunak and Hunt, for their sins, are right that inflation is public enemy number one. Tackle that, and it unlocks so many of our economic problems. Lower inflation means cheaper goods, cheaper borrowing, both the government's and yours and mine, cheaper mortgages, and a boost in the value of the pound in your pocket. Lose-lose becomes win-win. So inflation is the main argument against bumper pay rises. We've seen it throughout history, with Harold Wilson offering 20, 25 and 30% pay rises to compete with inflation and keep the unions happy. By doing this, you're effectively creating economic quicksand, and it's a race to the bottom. There's also the small matter of over £2 trillion worth of national debt. Any pay rises will come from borrowed billions. It's deeply unethical that future generations should pick up the tab for this, and it's dangerous to further expose Britain to the vagaries of Rolex-wearing financiers around the world, upon whose largesse we are now sadly reliant. Let me be clear that millions in the public sector and in the private sector deserve a pay rise. I believe that Britain is underpaid. The nurses, lecturers, teachers, you name it, they have suffered real terms pay cuts. They have a case, as do the unions. As many are suffering in-work poverty, there can even be a case made for the strikes. People are desperate. And of course, so many of these industries could have had a financial boost if it wasn't for what was, in my opinion, the catastrophically expensive and failed experiment of lockdowns, which, don't forget, saw the government pay healthy people to stay at home, covering 80% of their wages. We borrowed £500 billion and we shut the economy down on and off for 2.5 years and closed once viable businesses. And I don't remember any of the unions at the time pushing back on the idea of lockdowns or work-from-home orders, which damaged the economy too. Far from it. The unions were at the forefront of the hysterical culture of safetyism, which descended upon the public sector. It was the unions that clamoured for restrictions, arguing the safety of their members was paramount. And of course, it was the teaching unions who turbocharged pressure on the government to close schools, a policy that very few are now willing to defend. The government were clearly trying to save lives with lockdowns and other COVID measures, and they were trying to prevent the NHS from becoming overwhelmed. The measures were backed by the vast majority of respected scientists and health professionals. But, as I argued at the time, the cure looked to be worse than the disease itself. And I believe that history has judged that lockdown sceptic view very kindly. I always argue the worst aspect of the COVID measures was the economic damage. Why? Because no country ever improved the health of its people by making itself poorer. So here we are today, with many Brits struggling with a cost of living crisis and many relying on food banks. Well, I've been very clear since the spring of 2020, this experiment to stop a seasonal respiratory virus, non-fatal to most, would have dire consequences. Well, here we are. Above and beyond the economic madness of what the unions are currently asking for, there is a moral case against this industrial action too. No industrial action by nurses, ambulance drivers or firefighters should risk human life, but clearly it does and it will. How is that acceptable? And no industrial action on the part of teachers should impact children, but of course it will. Have kids not suffered enough from school closures during the pandemic? My kids are in the state sector and they've been stuck at home all day like thousands. The only thing they've probably learned today is how to murder hookers and gangsters on Grand Theft Auto. How can closed schools, a restricted ambulance service, nurses absent from wards and firefighters off duty possibly be acceptable? The economic and moral case for the strikes is non-existent. Perhaps we should just bring in the army to run the whole country. Sadly, they're not big enough these days. Britain isn't working, and it doesn't look like that will change anytime soon.